Mr. O'Neill, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the kind introduction. So my name is Conor O'Neill. I'm a researcher based in Dublin, and I've been very lucky to work closely with Senator Black on the legislation and alongside a number of civil society organisations in Dublin and around the world in preparing and progressing the legislation. I think Senator Black gave a really powerful, impassioned overview of the bill and why she's acted so passionately behind it. And I want to pick up on a few important points. The first is that with this bill, we are seeking merely to give effect, to give meaningful effect to the basic rules of international law. So as has been repeatedly reaffirmed in this chamber and around the world, the settlements constructed by Israel on occupied territory in the West Bank are a flagrant violation of international law. They're a presumptive war crime under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. They violate the Fourth Geneva Convention. And these are not just abstract legal principles written on paper. They have to mean something. And they were designed multilaterally to protect against the persistent human rights violations that you can see every day in the West Bank that are described in such harrowing detail by human rights defenders and civil society organizations that were described in the panel this morning. So 15 years ago, when the International Court of Justice held that the settlements were illegal, they noted the obligation of third states not to recognize that illegality. And they added, and I quote, they called on states not to render aid or assistance in maintaining that illegal situation. So the bill is very much tabled in that spirit. It is a step towards actually fulfilling an existing obligation by ensuring that no Irish commercial activity will sustain a manifestly and unambiguously illegal situation in terms of international law and human rights. In that sense as well, I think it's important to say that this is not a solo run or contrary to a spirit of multilateralism. And Senator Black touched on this. There's a real desire by the bill's sponsors to give some leadership, to offer new thinking, to try and step forward with practical, tangible steps that can be taken. But this is not realistically a new policy. We are merely trying to give effect to existing policy, to existing international law, to existing resolutions passed in this chamber and in the European Union and in various other international fora. And in fact, in that sense, it is an endorsement of multilateralism to say that when we have these processes, when we come together as an international community and we set these rules and we pass these resolutions, that we will actually take them seriously, that they won't be words on paper, and we will take the steps that we can meaningfully take to ensure that those resolutions and rules are actually respected. I think there's a real sense as well from the organisations who've worked so hard on the bill is that this is especially important for small states like Ireland. We have always emphasised that we benefit from, and everybody benefits from, an international order that's based on the rule of law and respect for human rights. That has been a fundamental contribution that Irish people and civil society organisations and the Irish state have made internationally to emphasise the importance of human rights. And the human rights movement itself has always maintained that the application of those laws should not be based on a kind of crude form of realpolitik or a belief that might is right. It should be applied equally. And violations of international law have to have meaningful consequences. In the European Union, for example, you can consider the response in relation to breaches of international law by Russia in Crimea. The importation of goods was banned, visas were suspended, assets were frozen, and several other more significant sanctions were taken. And that all happened within a matter of months. In relation to Palestine, we've been talking about the occupation for over 50 years. And it really doesn't seem that commensurate responses have been forthcoming. And again, the bill is very much presented in that spirit. I think a lot of the organisations as well who've worked on the bill, myself included, have done so very much in the context of a growing appreciation of the link between business and human rights. So your commercial activity is not divorced from political impact. in many cases that commercial support can be as important as political support. And in some cases, it almost amounts to the same thing. So we've pursued the initiative in that spirit, and we are essentially seeking a binding commitment in domestic Irish law, a statutory commitment that Irish commercial activity will not sustain manifestly, unambiguously illegal situations. And I think a lot of those organizations as well are looking on to these chambers in hope that there will be a binding treaty on business and human rights passed in the near future, and I commend you all in your work in getting to that point. Coming from that commercial and economic perspective, the bill, as Senator Black mentioned, is trying to kind of highlight and address what we see as a fundamental disconnect in the policy as it stands. And that applies to Ireland, but also to everybody else who is of a like mind on this particular issue, in that we repeatedly and consistently condemn the construction of settlements as illegal, but on the other hand, we continue to provide this sustained economic and financial support for buying the proceeds of that illegality. We talk about settlements as an obstacle to peace, as undermining the very basis of a two-state solution, and Ilan Baruch spoke so powerfully about this morning from an Israeli civil society perspective. But it's almost impossible to square that kind of rhetorical commitment to those goals with the continued financial support that flows to the settlements. That trade is helping, and this is the feedback that we hear constantly, and everyone in this room will have heard from civil society, that it's helping to entrench a discriminatory two-tier system that's operating in the West Bank. If you look at basic figures, World Bank estimates say that exports from Israeli settlements to the European Union come to about €230 million a year. Palestinian exports to the European Union come to about €15 million a year. So consider how stark those figures are. It means that as a bloc, the European Union is importing more, 15 times more, from settlements that they routinely condemn as illegal than from Palestine itself. And that imbalance feeds into everything else that's happening. World Bank estimates in 2013 said that the restrictions imposed on the Palestinian economy by the occupation, the restrictions on movement, the roads, and so on, have cost the Palestinian economy $3.5 billion. Again, that is not just numbers on a piece of paper. It has a real material impact on the capacity to provide things like food, healthcare, shelter, and to grow a functioning and vibrant economy. So there is a commercial basis to all of this, and that's what the bill is trying to speak to. A couple of more points briefly to touch on something. I want to kind of address the contention that the bill is in some way anti-Israeli. It is not. And it should not be seen as a partisan position to seek to merely reflect the rule of international law. Before the bill was last debated in the lower house of the Irish Parliament and passed overwhelmingly by that house, a number of extremely eminent and, in my view, extremely brave Israeli citizens, civil society members, human rights defenders, and so on, wrote a letter to every member of Parliament, to the Prime Minister, and to the largest newspaper in the country, in an open letter, urging support for the bill. And they did that as proud citizens of Israel who care deeply for their country, but who oppose the reality of what's happening under occupation, the indignity and the injustice of it, who believe in the rule of law, who believe that a lasting solution has to be based on international law and human rights. And I think it does a great disservice to those people and to different human rights organizations based in Israel to suggest that that is in any way anti-Israeli. It isn't. It is anti-occupation, and it is pro-human rights at its essence. And I suppose to close, because I know we'll have chance for questions and answers and so on after, but the purpose of the panel is to talk about practical steps to stem annexation. And the Occupied Territories Bill is presented as something that we believe is a tangible, measured, peaceful, practical step that can help move us in that direction. But it's also important that if we're talking about annexation, that it isn't just some sort of abstract concept that is being threatened. Because the feedback from lots of colleagues in in civil society in the region is that annexation is a pretty accurate description of the reality on the ground already. And there might come a specific moment, a specific event that marks a formal de jure annexation. But in reality, that moment will merely be the high watermark of a process that took place over decades. It will have been inch by inch, settlement by settlement, fact on the ground by fact on the ground. And as an international community, we won't be able to say that we didn't see it coming or that it happened overnight or that it was a specific moment. It doesn't happen in a moment. It happens gradually. It happens as the result of decades of missed opportunities. And a lot of people in this room are significantly older than I am. And they've probably been talking about this conflict since well before I was born. And I think we need to reflect on that really and say that, like Rapporteur Link said this morning, the point is coming at which we will be driving past the last exit on the road to annexation. And that's the spirit in which the bill is tabled, to not just let it go and to give up on it. So I think in closing, just to restate that a solution to conflict, whether it's in Israel, Palestine, anywhere else in the world, has to be based on international law, human rights. That's what we took as the starting principle when drafting the bill over 2 years ago. A big coalition of people worked behind it, and that's the spirit in which we table it. And any questions or comments people have, would be delighted to hear them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Neill, for your intervention and emphasizing how the bill addresses Ireland's obligations under international law.